50 years, hidden. The teachings Seth was never allowed to share. There's a file cabinet in the Yale University Library. Inside it, gathering dust for decades, are transcripts that were never meant to reach you. Between 1963 and 1984, Jane Roberts sat in her living room in Elmira, New York, and channeled Seth, a multidimensional teacher whose words would reshape metaphysics for millions. You've read Seth Speaks. You've underlined passages in The Nature of Personal Reality. But here's what they don't tell you. Of the over 1,500 sessions Jane channeled, only a fraction made it to print. The rest filed away, marked personal, labeled not for publication. Some transcripts were deemed too volatile, too destabilizing for a 1970s audience that was barely ready to accept reincarnation, let alone what we're about to explore. Rob Butts, Jane's husband and the meticulous documenter of every session, made editorial choices. So did the publishers. And so, allegedly, did Seth himself, instructing them which teachings to release and which to hold back, claiming that certain knowledge was time-locked, meant only for future generations. Why would a non-physical teacher withhold information? Because consciousness has a speed limit. Reveal too much, too fast, and you don't enlighten people, you shatter them. Imagine handing calculus to a kindergartner. The math isn't wrong, the timing is. Seth understood that collective reality operates on consensus, and if you destabilize that consensus before individuals have developed the inner architecture to handle it, you create chaos, not awakening. But here's what changed. We're living in that future now. Reality is glitching. The Mandela effect isn't just internet folklore. It's people waking up to the fact that timelines are fluid. Mass synchronicities are spiking. The agreed-upon world is showing cracks. And suddenly the teachings that were too dangerous for 1975 are exactly what we need for 2025. So here's the promise of this transmission. I'm going to walk you through the doctrines that Jane and Rob quietly archived, the sessions that never made it into your Seth books, and the reason they're surfacing now. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is archival reality. The question isn't whether these teachings exist. It's whether you're ready to know what Seth said when he thought no one was supposed to be listening. If this feels forbidden, good. That means you're paying attention. Here's where it gets shocking. In unpublished fragments from the early 1970s, Seth introduced a concept so dangerous it was immediately suppressed. Consensual reality collapse. You think the physical world is solid because atoms and physics and all that reassuring scientific materialism, right? Wrong. Seth taught that physical reality is solid because we agree it is, not metaphorically. Literally, the chair you're sitting on, the ground beneath your feet, the laws of gravity. They persist because billions of consciousnesses are participating in the same hallucination, reinforcing it moment by moment. Seth called this Framework 1, the agreed-upon consensus reality. But here's the revelation that got buried, that consensus is negotiable. Small groups of individuals who withdraw their belief from consensus. Reality can create localized distortions, pockets where the rules don't apply. This isn't manifestation as the New Age movement repackaged it, where you visualize a parking space and feel grateful. This is reality architecture. This is withdrawing your vote from the collective agreement and watching physics crack open. Seth allegedly described how this works in one restricted session. He explained that every impossible phenomenon, spontaneous remission of terminal illness, objects teleporting, time slips where someone loses 3 hours with no memory, these aren't miracles or glitches. They're moments when someone's consciousness briefly exited the consensus, stopped agreeing to the rules, and reality had no choice but to comply. Because reality, Seth insisted, is obedient. It will give you exactly what you believe, and if you stop believing in limits, limits dissolve. But here's why this teaching was considered too volatile. If enough people understood this simultaneously, consensus reality could destabilize too rapidly. Imagine if 100,000 people suddenly stopped believing in gravity. What happens to the airplane in the sky? What happens to the hospital patient whose surgeon is suddenly operating in a reality where biology is negotiable? Seth warned that premature collapse of consensus could trigger mass psychosis, reality fragmentation, a world where nothing is reliable because no one agrees on what's real anymore. So the teaching was withheld, not because it's false, because it's powerful, and power without preparation is catastrophe. But Seth also said this: there would come a time when consensus reality would begin cracking on its own, when the old agreements would fail not because anyone was attacking them, but because collective consciousness had outgrown them. We'd need this teaching then, he said. We'd need to know that the glitches aren't the end of the world. They're the beginning of a new agreement. Look around. Does reality feel as solid as it did 10 years ago? Are you noticing things that don't make sense? Memories that don't match? Historical facts that seem to shift? That's not you losing your mind. That's consensus reality showing its seams. And the question isn't whether it's happening. It's whether you'll panic when it accelerates or whether you'll recognize it as the invitation it is, to stop being a passive participant in someone else's reality and start architecting your own. Seth's hidden teaching wasn't a prophecy, it was a preparation manual, and if you're feeling the ground shift beneath you, you're right on time. Every spiritual teaching loves to talk about the higher self, the enlightened entity, the multidimensional you that's all love and wisdom and unconditional compassion. Seth's published books emphasize this too, your entity as the loving oversoul, birthing lifetimes to explore growth and joy. But in certain restricted sessions, Seth spoke bluntly about something he called the shadow entity, and this teaching was so uncomfortable that it never made it to print. Here it is. Your entity doesn't only incarnate saints, healers, and artists. It also incarnates tyrants, abusers, and killers, not as mistakes, not as karmic punishments, as necessary explorations of consciousness. Because an entity that only knows light doesn't know itself fully. To be truly multidimensional, to exhaust every possibility of experience, consciousness must explore cruelty, violence, destruction, not as aberrations, but as data. Seth allegedly told Jane and Rob that every entity, including theirs, including yours, has birthed what he called shadow lives, incarnations designed to explore the darkest edges of free will. Murderers, dictators, predators, these aren't bad souls. They're roles taken on by the same entity that also births mystics and mothers. And here's the part that makes people recoil. You, right now, have probable selves in alternate timelines committing atrocities. That capacity is in you because your entity is exploring all expressions simultaneously. Why was this teaching suppressed? Because it obliterates simplistic morality. If your entity incarnates both the victim and the victimizer, both the saint and the psychopath, how do you maintain righteous anger? How do you justify punishment? How do you cling to the comfortable illusion that you're purely good and they're purely evil? You can't. The teaching strips away spiritual bypassing, the pretense that awakening is all about ascending into love and light. No, awakening is about recognizing that your greater self has been the monster too. But here's the reframe Seth offered, the piece that makes this bearable. Those shadow lives aren't random chaos. They're purposeful. An entity that births a lifetime of cruelty does so to learn cruelty from the inside, to exhaust that frequency, so that in other lifetimes it can embody compassion with full knowledge of what compassion prevents. The tyrant and the healer are the same consciousness gathering experience, And the more an entity explores shadow, the more it can eventually transmute shadow into wisdom. Seth warned that revealing this teaching prematurely would cause two reactions. Either people would use it to justify harm, "It's fine, my entity wanted me to do this," or they'd collapse into nihilism, believing nothing matters. Both are misinterpretations. The teaching isn't permission to enact cruelty. It's an invitation to recognize your capacity for it, to see it in yourself, and to choose differently, not out of naive purity, but out of conscious accountability. You have a dark, multidimensional self. Denying it doesn't make you good. Integrating it makes you whole. If this disturbs you, sit with it. That disturbance is your ego resisting the truth that you are not as innocent as you'd like to believe, and not as guilty as you fear. You are vast, and vastness contains everything. The question is, now that you know your entity explores shadow, how will you hold that knowledge without using it as excuse or collapsing into despair? Because how you answer that question determines whether you're ready for the rest of what's coming. Seth taught that dreams aren't just symbolic. They're laboratories where probable realities are tested before manifesting physically. You dream about quitting your job. In Framework 2, that dream is a prototype, and if enough emotional energy fuels it, it bleeds into waking life. But in certain sessions, Seth went further. He offered what can only be called instructions for deliberate dreamtime manipulation, techniques for entering others' dreams, for hijacking collective dream spaces, for planting suggestions that would manifest in their waking reality. This wasn't metaphor. Seth described the dream world as a shared dimension with its own physics, accessible to anyone trained enough to remain conscious while the body sleeps. And in that dimension, he said, you could do things. You could create dream beacons, psychic signals that attract specific souls into your dream space for conversation, healing, or influence. You could plant seeds in the collective unconscious, ideas that would germinate and bloom as cultural shifts weeks or months later. You could even engage in what Seth bluntly called lucid dream warfare, psychic espionage, sabotage, coercion enacted in the dream state where the target has no conscious defenses. Why was this teaching suppressed? Because it's ethically ambiguous. Because dream manipulation, like any power, can be used to heal or to harm, and the line between influence and violation is disturbingly thin. Seth allegedly insisted that these techniques should only be transmitted to individuals who had already mastered self-awareness, who could wield this knowledge without abusing it. Yet he did transmit them at least once, in a session Rob marked not for publication. Here's the mechanics Seth outlined. To enter another person's dream, you must first establish resonance. Spend waking hours thinking of them with focused intention, creating a psychic thread. Then, in your own lucid dream state, you visualize that thread as a bridge and cross it. If they're dreaming simultaneously, you'll find yourself in their dream landscape. Most people won't notice you. Their dream self assumes you belong there. But if you want them to remember the encounter upon waking, you must do something disruptive. Speak their name 3 times, touch them with both hands, or create a symbol they associate with waking life. To plant a suggestion in the collective unconscious, Seth said, you must dream repetitively. The same image, the same narrative, night after night, charged with emotional intensity. Eventually, that dream seed drops into the collective pool, and others begin dreaming it too without knowing why. This is how cultural shifts begin, Seth claimed, not through waking discourse, but through the dream world, where ideas bypass rational resistance and root directly into the subconscious. And the warning Seth gave? Misuse of dreamtime manipulation creates karmic entanglement. If you enter someone's dream to manipulate or harm, you bind your consciousness to theirs across lifetimes. You'll meet them again, in body or in dream. and the entanglement will have to be resolved, painfully, inevitably. This isn't punishment from some external judge. It's the physics of consciousness. You tangle yourself. You must untangle yourself. So why reveal this now? Because the dream world is already being manipulated by governments researching remote viewing, by corporations studying subliminal influence, by individuals who discovered these techniques independently and are using them without ethical framework. Seth's teaching wasn't meant as a how-to guide. It was meant as a warning and a manual for those already noticing they have this capacity. If you've ever had dreams where you felt like you were being watched, where a presence seemed to know you too well, where you woke with the unsettling sense that someone was in your mind, you weren't imagining it. The dream world has rules, and some people know them. Seth's public teachings radiate egalitarian comfort. All consciousness is equally valid, all realities equally real, all souls on equal footing in the grand experiment of existence. But in private sessions he described something he rarely let surface in print, a functional hierarchy among entities not based on superiority or worth, but on experience. Some entities are ancient. They've orchestrated thousands of incarnations across multiple universes, refined their understanding over eons. Others are young, experimenting with their first handful of physical lives, barely aware of their own multidimensional nature. Your entity has an evolutionary age, and that age determines what you can access, what you remember, and how fluidly you navigate between dimensions. An ancient entity, Seth explained, possesses capabilities a nascent entity cannot yet wield: deeper memory of pre-incarnational origins, greater fluidity across probable realities, more sophisticated manipulation of time and space. This isn't about one soul being better than another. It's about capacity, the way a PhD has access to knowledge a kindergartner doesn't. The knowledge isn't withheld as punishment. The kindergartner simply hasn't built the cognitive framework yet. Why was this teaching kept hidden? Because it contradicts the soothing egalitarianism of New Age thought. We want to believe everyone is equally evolved, equally close to enlightenment, equally capable. But Seth insisted that's not true. Not because the universe is unfair, but because consciousness evolves. It gathers complexity, experience, wisdom. An entity that's lived 5 lifetimes has less integrated understanding than an entity that's lived 5,000. And pretending otherwise is like pretending a toddler and a neurosurgeon have equal medical knowledge. Here's how Seth said you could discern your entity's approximate age. Look at your life themes. Are you endlessly fascinated by metaphysics, reincarnation, multidimensional reality, not as intellectual curiosity, but as remembering? That's the signature of an older entity, one that's done this many times and retains subconscious memory. Do you feel out of place on Earth, as though this reality is too slow, too dense, too limiting? That could indicate you've incarnated from an entity accustomed to subtler dimensions, dragged into physical form for reasons you're still decoding. But here's the counterintuitive part. Older entities often choose harder lives. They incarnate into trauma, poverty, systemic oppression, not as punishment, but as graduate-level curriculum. A young entity might choose a simple, joyful life to learn the basics. How bodies work, how emotions feel, how relationships form. An ancient entity doesn't need those lessons anymore. It comes for the extremes: profound suffering that catalyzes awakening, impossible circumstances that force mastery, shadow work so intense it accelerates evolution by lifetimes. If your life has been relentlessly difficult, if you've faced challenges that would break most people and somehow you're still here, consider this. Maybe you're not cursed. Maybe you're not being punished for past life sins. Maybe your entity is ancient and it chose this incarnation precisely because of its difficulty, because easy lives no longer teach you anything. That doesn't make the pain less real, but it reframes it. From meaningless suffering to purposeful intensity. From victimhood to fierce multidimensional agency. Seth warned against using this teaching to foster spiritual elitism. I'm an old soul, therefore I'm better than you. That misses the point. Older entities have more experience, yes, but they also carry more responsibility. With greater capacity comes the obligation to use it wisely, to incarnate not for personal glory, but for collective evolution. If you suspect you're from an ancient entity, the question isn't, what privileges does this grant me? It's, what am I here to transmute? The hierarchy is real, and it's not about worth, it's about readiness. You're reading this because your entity has walked this path before. Act accordingly. Death is not the end, but Seth taught something you won't find in the published books. How you die determines where you go and how quickly you reorient in the between-lives state. Most people die unconsciously, terrified, clinging to the body until the last second, and then a blackout. They wake disoriented, confused, sometimes convinced they're still alive. It can take what feels like years, time is subjective there, to fully recognize they've transitioned. But Seth offered exit protocols, explicit step-by-step instructions for maintaining consciousness through the death process, avoiding disorientation and immediately recognizing the between-lives landscape. Why weren't these published? Because Seth warned that premature focus on death protocols could make people death-eager, causing them to abandon incarnational responsibilities, to treat physical life as something to escape rather than explore. He insisted that mastering death requires mastering life first, building emotional resilience, spiritual clarity, psychological integration. Only then is the death manual useful, otherwise it's dangerous, but he did transmit the protocols at least once. Here's what he taught. As the body begins to shut down, whether through illness, accident, or age, there's a moment of choice. Most people panic, gripping tighter to physicality, fighting the inevitable. Seth said, don't. Instead, shift your awareness inward. Recognize that you are not the body. The body is a vehicle you're stepping out of. Focus on a point of light in your mind, not an external light, but an internal one, the core of your consciousness. Hold that light steady as physical sensation fades. Then comes what Seth called the white noise phase, the first moments post-death. It's not silence, it's a roaring, staticky void where untrained souls panic, fragment, and lose coherence. This is where many become wanderers, disembodied consciousnesses stuck in liminal zones, unable to reincarnate or fully transition because they shattered in the white noise and can't reassemble themselves. Seth's instruction, don't resist the noise. Let it wash over you like a wave. It will pass. And when it does, you'll find yourself in a landscape. That landscape is Framework 2, the dimension between physical incarnations. It's not heaven, not hell. It's a psychic environment shaped partly by your expectations and partly by your entity's design. If you expect pearly gates, you might see them, but they're symbolic, not literal. Seth said the key is to recognize it as Framework 2 immediately. Look for your entity's team, the multidimensional aspects of yourself, the other incarnations, the guides who are really just older versions of you. They'll appear as presences, lights, or familiar faces. Do not be distracted by loved ones who appear to greet you. Some are real, but some are projections of your own longing. Test them. Ask a question only the real person would know the answer to. Once reoriented, you'll undergo what Seth called the life review, not a judgment by external authority, but a self-directed replay of your incarnation from all perspectives. You'll experience every moment you caused harm, but from the victim's point of view. You'll feel every act of kindness you gave, from the recipient's heart. This isn't punishment, it's education. You're gathering emotional data, integrating the experience, understanding what that lifetime taught you, and then choice, reincarnate immediately, designing a new life to address what you didn't complete, or rest in framework 2, exploring other dimensions, connecting with other entities before diving back into form. Seth said there's no should. Some souls reincarnate within hours, eager to continue. Others linger for what feels like centuries, integrating, healing, preparing. Here's the teaching that was suppressed. If you master these exit protocols, you don't just die consciously, you arrive consciously. You skip the confusion, the disorientation, the wandering. You step out of the body like stepping out of a coat, fully aware, fully sovereign. And that changes everything about how you live now. Because once you know you're not trapped here, that death is a doorway you can walk through with eyes open. The fear that controls most human behavior dissolves. You're free, not reckless, free. Seth offered this knowledge as a gift, but also a responsibility. Use it to live more fully, not to escape prematurely. Death will come. When it does, meet it awake. Probable realities are real. Seth taught that every choice spawns alternate timelines where the other choice was made, and all versions of you live simultaneously in framework 2. But in certain sessions, he described a phenomenon he called fracture points, moments when your probable selves diverge so radically that your consciousness splits, and you begin living multiple timelines at once without realizing it. This isn't poetic language. Seth claimed it's a diagnosable condition, and the symptoms are disturbing. Contradictory memories, objects that appear and disappear, relationships that feel like they both did and didn't happen, the eerie sense that yesterday occurred differently than you remember. Fracture points happen during trauma, major decisions, or spiritual breakthroughs, any moment when you become untethered from consensus reality. Your consciousness, stressed beyond coherence, doesn't fully commit to one timeline. Part of you takes the left turn, part of you takes the right. And because Framework 2 doesn't operate on linear time, both timelines feel equally real. You wake up remembering two different versions of the same conversation. You search for an object you know you placed on the table, but it's not there, because in this timeline, you never put it there. In the other timeline, it's still there. But you're bleeding between them and you don't know how to stop. Seth allegedly taught that fracture is more common than people realize, but most dismiss the symptoms as faulty memory, delusion, or just stress. It's not. It's multidimensional overlap, your consciousness stretched thin across timelines that were never meant to run simultaneously in your awareness. And here's the danger. If you fracture too severely for too long, you can lose the ability to reintegrate. You become what Seth called diffuse, a consciousness scattered across so many timelines that none of them feel fully real, and you drift through life in a dissociative fog, never fully present anywhere. So how do you know if you're fractured? Look for these signs. You have vivid memories of events other people swear never happened, but you know they happened. The details are too specific to be confabulation. You experience déjà vu so intense, it feels like remembering, not just familiarity. You lose time, not minutes, but hours, with no explanation. And when you return, the world feels subtly wrong, as though something shifted while you were gone. People close to you mention things you allegedly said or did, and you have zero recollection, yet they're not lying. If you're fractured, here's Seth's protocol for recoherence. First, stop making major decisions. Every big choice during fracture worsens the split. Ground yourself in routine. Same sleep schedule, same meals, same routes. This creates psychic anchors. Second, engage in timeline negotiation, a meditative practice where you consciously call back your scattered selves. Visualize your probable selves as threads of light extending from your core. Gently, without force, imagine reeling them back in, one by one, until they merge into a single coherent stream. This isn't instant. It takes weeks, sometimes months. Third, and this is crucial, choose one timeline and commit. Stop trying to live in all of them. Pick the reality that feels most aligned with your entity's purpose and pour your energy there. The other timelines don't disappear. Your probable selves continue in them. But you, this focal point of consciousness, stops bleeding between. You solidify. You cohere. Seth withheld this teaching because it destabilizes the illusion that reality is fixed. And most people need that illusion to function. But we're in an era where reality is visibly glitching, where the Mandela effect is mainstream discourse, where people are spontaneously fracturing without guidance. This teaching isn't paranoia. It's a field manual for navigating a dimension most people don't even know they're in. If any of this resonates viscerally, if you've been experiencing these symptoms and thought you were losing your mind, you're not. You're losing your timeline, and now you know how to get it back. So here's the meta question. Why were these teachings suppressed for 50 years? It wasn't arbitrary censorship or some shadowy conspiracy. Jane Roberts herself was ambivalent. She feared certain teachings would be misinterpreted, weaponized, used to justify harm or spiritual bypassing. Rob made editorial choices based on what he thought a mainstream audience could handle. Publishers wanted marketable metaphysics, not doctrine that could trigger lawsuits or moral panic. And the cultural climate of the 1970s and 80s, still reeling from the collapse of traditional religion, tentatively exploring reincarnation and chakras, wasn't ready for teachings this destabilizing. But there's another layer. Seth himself allegedly stated that some teachings were time-locked, sequestered deliberately, meant to be discovered only when collective consciousness reached a threshold. And that threshold, he said, would be recognizable. Reality would begin glitching on its own. The agreed-upon world would show cracks. People would report Mandela effects, spontaneous timeline shifts, mass synchronicities. The old consensus would fail not because anyone was attacking it, but because collective consciousness had outgrown it, like a snake shedding skin. Look around. Does 2025 feel like 2015? Does reality have the same solidity it did a decade ago? Are you noticing things that don't make sense? Historical facts that seem to shift? Memories that contradict each other? A pervasive sense that the world is becoming stranger? That's not paranoia. That's consensus reality cracking. And suddenly the suppressed teachings make sense. The doctrine of consensual reality collapse explains why the world feels unstable. The fracture point teaching explains why so many people are dissociating. The exit protocols become urgent as death anxiety spikes. The shadow entity teaching becomes necessary as moral certainty crumbles and we're forced to confront our capacity for both good and harm. Seth didn't withhold these teachings to control you. He sequestered them because premature revelation would have caused more harm than growth. But he also seeded them, archived them, left breadcrumbs for the generation that would need them. And if you're watching this, reading this, feeling this, you're part of that generation. The seal broke not because someone pried it open, but because the timing arrived. The world became weird enough, unstable enough, multidimensional enough that these teachings shifted from dangerous to necessary. This is the responsibility. You now hold knowledge that was deliberately kept from public view, not because it's lies, but because it's powerful. And power without wisdom corrodes. These teachings aren't entertainment. They're not spiritual flex points to impress friends with. They're tools, volatile ones, for those ready to handle the weight of multidimensional awareness. If the shadow entity teaching disturbed you, let it complicate your certainty. If the exit protocols intrigued you, remember, mastering death means mastering life. first. If the fracture point teaching resonated, don't panic. Recognize you're being invited to recohere. You weren't supposed to find this teaching until you were ready to integrate it without fracturing yourself further. The question was never whether Seth was allowed to share these doctrines. The question is whether you are ready to use them without collapsing into nihilism, spiritual bypassing, or misuse. Because the teachings are neutral. They describe how reality works, how consciousness operates, how the multidimensional self functions. What you do with that knowledge determines whether it liberates you or destroys you. Seth's legacy wasn't meant to create another religion, another dogma, another set of rules to follow blindly. It was meant to shatter the comfortable illusions and hand you the keys to your own reality. But keys open doors, and some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. You walk through aware of the responsibility, or you stay on this side and pretend you never heard the knock. We've reached the end of this transmission, but this isn't where the journey completes. It's where it deepens. You now carry teachings that were deliberately withheld for half a century, not because they're lies, but because they're true. And truth without readiness is corrosive. Seth never intended these doctrines to become new dogmas, new spiritual credentials to collect and display. They're tools, and like all tools, they can build or destroy, depending on the hand that wields them. If the teaching on consensual reality collapse unsettled you, good. It should strip away the fantasy that reality is neutral or fixed. You're not a passive observer, you're an active architect, and the world bends to what you believe more than you've been told. But with that power comes the question, what will you build? Will you use this understanding to manipulate, to dominate, to force your reality onto others? Or will you wield it with the reverence it demands, recognizing that every withdrawal from consensus affects not just you, but the collective fabric we all inhabit? If the shadow entity teaching disturbed you, let it. It's supposed to complicate your moral certainty, to reveal that your greater self contains both the light you celebrate and the darkness you deny. You are not purely good. You are not purely anything. You are vast, and vastness holds all possibilities. The work isn't to exile your shadow, it's to integrate it consciously, to see your capacity for harm and choose differently, not from naive innocence, but from hard-won wisdom. If the exit protocols intrigued you, remember what Seth insisted. Mastering death means mastering life first. The protocols aren't an escape hatch for those tired of incarnation. They're a framework for those who've lived so fully, so consciously, that death becomes just another threshold, crossed with eyes open. Don't reach for them prematurely. Build the life first. Integrate the lessons. Then the protocols become tools rather than temptations. And if the fracture point teaching resonated, if you recognized yourself in those symptoms, don't spiral into fear. You're not broken. You're not losing your mind. You're caught between timelines, and now you have the manual for recoherence. Use it. Ground yourself. Choose one reality and commit. The other versions of you continue in their timelines, but you, this focal point, must solidify or you'll drift forever, never fully present anywhere. This knowledge isn't for entertainment. It's not for intellectual collection or spiritual tourism. It's for those who are living at the edge of consensus reality's collapse, who are feeling the ground shift, who are ready to navigate multidimensional awareness without fracturing or fleeing. You're being invited to step into a level of responsibility most people never touch. The responsibility of knowing how reality works, how consciousness operates, how the game is structured, and then playing anyway, but consciously, deliberately, with honor. Seth's teachings were never about ascending out of physical reality into some blissful non-physical dimension where nothing hurts and everything is love. They were about mastering physical reality by understanding its mechanics, about incarnating fully rather than spiritually bypassing, about using your multidimensional nature not to escape, but to create. You are here in a body, on Earth, in this timeline, for reasons your entity designed before you arrived. The teachings don't release you from that purpose, they clarify it. So here's the final question, the one that determines whether this transmission lands or evaporates. Are you ready? Not in the bravado sense, not as performance, but truly ready to hold this knowledge without misusing it, to integrate it without fracturing, to let it transform how you live without using it as justification for harm or escape. If you've made it this far, if the weight of these teachings feels both unbearable and right, then mark your presence, not casually, not as a social media gesture, but as a vow, because the seal broke for a reason, and that reason is you. Comment, I'm ready. Only if you mean it. This knowledge carries weight, and so do you.